we may ask the question of why we are not fully awakened already. It's not a trivial question. Why are we in a state of suffering and delusion? It's a difficult question to answer because it seems odd or counterintuitive that this state of samsaric existence is present at all. A lot of fuss and bother. It would seem much simpler just to begin and end with Nibbana. Why are we bothering with all this coming into existence and struggling and suffering and carrying on and all this hoopla? Uh, in some strains of Buddhism, you see in Zen, for example, there's a saying that all beings are Buddhas from beginningless time. And the emphasis of that way of thinking is that we're already all fully awakened Buddhas, we just don't know it. And the trick is just to know it. And seeing things in that way, puts the emphasis on the possibility of potentiality of full awakening. You see in Christian religion, the idea of original sin and the fall from grace has a kind of a mythological parallel in the story in the Anganya Sutta of the Abhisara beings who first came to this earth when it congealed and fell to coarser state of existence by tasting the foam on the surface of the earth. This is a metaphorical expression of the entanglement of consciousness in matter and sensuality. But in itself, it's not a full answer because it pushes back the question to why are these beings in the Abhisara state? How did they get into this high Brahmic existence, which is still samsaric, it's still conditioned? The Buddha, in talking about the dependent origination, he phrases the question in this way. He asks, how is it that beings wander endlessly in this samsara? And his answer is just because of ignorance, of not knowing, not seeing. And it goes on, not knowing, not seeing what? It's not knowing and not seeing the Four Noble Truths, which are the truths of dukkha, suffering or imperfection or unsatisfactoriness, etc. The truth of dukkha, which is the existential reality, which is samsara. The truth of the origin of dukkha, which is tanha, craving. So this is the motive engine of samsaric existence, is this craving. I was saying, love makes the world go round. Yeah, so it's, craving is at the root of samsaric becoming, and it's craving for sense desire for becoming and not becoming. It's well, these are the three fundamental forms of craving. And in our present situation as human beings, the sense craving is the most problematic on a surface level. It's superficially the noisiest, demands our attention the most, causes the most immediate trouble. But it's relatively superficial, as much deeper and much more powerfully affecting our being at a deeper level are the cravings for being and non-being. Even when the desire for sense experience is muted or eliminated altogether, there still remains these deeper cravings. The third noble truth is the truth of the end of dukkha, which is the realization of the unconditioned, which is Nibbana, is the alternative to all of this. All this coming and going and rising and falling and all the fascination and terrors of samsara. And The fourth noble truth is the truth of the path leading out of samsaric becoming, where the Buddha lays out the practical 8 factors that need to be developed to make an end of craving and suffering. So we can see by this answer that the reason we're not experiencing full awakening immediately is because the deep underlying cause is ignorance, is not knowing and not seeing. And the effective mechanism is craving. So these are the 2 factors that that lay the basis for becoming, for samsaric existence. A Buddhist conception, it's not to be seen that there was ever a time when this was not so. So this is a different conception from a linear time sort of model. We see time as beginningless, without first point of origin. So it's not like we were originally fully awakened and through some error we fell from it. It's that in this mode of time we're experiencing cyclical time, and experience of Nirvana is outside of time. So it's called Amata, the deathless, which is quite different than saying it's immortal, which would be Nitya, permanent or unending, which would be an extension of linear time. There's a sense of these 2 modalities of time, the timelessness of Nirvana, Ekalako, and the experience of time, samsaric time, which is experienced by the individual psyche as being linear, but in the broader scheme is cyclical. It's just a endless cycling round and round, without a beginning, without an end. So that's kind of a broad brush answer to the question of why we're not fully awake, and why do we experience samsaric conditions, is because of ignorance, of not knowing, and because of the habit of craving, and the way out being the Eightfold Path. Coming out of that that broad brush kind of answer, if we look at the meditation tradition, development of Vipassana meditation, and the explanation of these factors found in the Abhidhamma, we find a different emphasis, and it's basically the same. It's not contradiction, but it's emphasizing things on a different sort of a level, that for a practical realization and of emergence from samsara. And that's overcoming ignorance by the seeing of the 3 characteristics, the 3 marks, which include dukkha, is the point of overlap with the 4 Noble Truths and the dependent origination, but also the other 2 marks of impermanence and not self, or anicca and anatta. It's by seeing things in terms of not seeing the 3 characteristics that the mind is deluded, that we experience ignorance. And this is in the suttas, and I think it's in the Anguttara Nikaya. There's a sutta that talks about the vipalasas, the hallucinations. These are given as 4. And they're the opposites of 3 characteristics, plus seeing the beautiful and the unbeautiful. So this is seeing pleasure in what is painful, seeing permanence in what is impermanent, seeing substantiality in that which is insubstantial, so missing the point of not self or emptiness, and seeing things as beautiful or attractive, lovely, the subha, when they are not desirable, pleasant, etc., asubha. And the analogy as a metaphor is given in this is a hunter wanting to catch deer. He makes a decoy deer out of sticks and wicker and puts it in the middle of a clearing. And then he hides in the brush at the edge of the clearing with his bow and arrow. And the deer come in and they see the decoy deer in the middle of the field and they say, "This place is safe. There's already a deer here." And they come into the field and come to their destruction, and the hunter shoots them with the bow and arrow. And the hunter is a sign for Mara, and the decoy deer is the sign for the vipalasas, the hallucinations. By seeing things wrongly, we go into the wrong pasture. Gochara, pasture, means like a abiding place of cattle, and it's used metaphorically often in the suttas as where the mind abides. The mind is like a cow wandering from pasture to pasture, and there's a safe pasture, which is the states of mindfulness and so on, and there's the unsafe pasture, which is the desires of the senses and of delusion, ill will, and so forth. And the mind, can go to this pasture or that pasture. So how this works in the practice of vipassana meditation is the attempt to observe clearly, dispassionately, immediately the dhammas that arise to the mind. It's useful to understand the meaning of this concept of a dhamma. A dhamma is the word means an object or phenomenon. These are the objects that arise in the mind. They're classed as dhammas. And each dhamma arises to the mind in sequence. The mind takes one dhamma at a time. And when the mind is swayed by the vipalasas, when it's corrupted by desire and ignorance, it does not perceive the dhammas clearly. It sees them as desirable or fearful or permanent or substantial. It sees them in these wrong ways that are not in accord with ultimate reality. And the effort is not to conjure up the characteristics as mental constructs. This is a misleading and useless, but to take off the distorting spectacles of wrong perception and see the dhammas in their own nature as they actually are. And if we're seeing them in a dispassionate way, not colored by desire or by fear, it's the kind of the attraction or repulsion, the movement towards or away, but we're just equanimously observing them in their own nature without reference to anything else, just perceiving them in their own nature, then we naturally see them as imperfect, as flawed, as partial, as fragmentary, conditioned, impermanent, and essentially empty. Another aspect of this concept of Dhamma is when the Dhammas are seen absolutely clearly, then we get to the bottom of things. We're seeing what are called Paramatta Dhammas, or ultimate Dhammas, ultimate reality that can't be parsed any further. There's something of a conceptual danger here, and if you've ever picked up books from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, and they criticize the Hinayana conceptions, they talk about that Hinayana sees the emptiness of self, but they don't see the emptiness of Dhammas. There's one Tibetan book that I was looking at once. It was kind of comical. It was supposed to be representing conversation that one of the Tibetan sages had with a Hinayana monk, and they were in agreement as long as they were talking about not self, emptiness of self. But then when he started talking about emptiness of dhammas, the Hinayana monk couldn't take it. He put his fingers in his ears and made a la 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 noise too. not listen to what was being said. One thing to understand with that, if you come across these Tibetan critiques, is that for historical reasons, the school that they're criticizing as Hinayana is not actually the Theravada, it's the Sarvastivada, who were the dominant school in northern India at one time. Now, unfortunately, there's no Sarvastivadas really left in the world to defend their position. So I don't know if it's even fair to say that they didn't see the emptiness of dhammas. But certainly in the Theravada Abhidhamma, it's clear that the dhammas themselves are empty. It's not a disputed point. The meaning of Paramattha Dhamma is not that they're ultimate nuggets of reality, but that what that means is that they're the end point of analysis. If you get down to the point of seeing Paramattha Dhammas, you can't dissect them any finer. It's as far as analysis can go. But it's still empty, impermanent, dependent. So there's still this sense of conditionality and emptiness, even in the dhammas. You know? But it is something to watch out for, not to fall into the idea of seeing the dhammas as intrinsically real. They're insubstantial in themselves because they only exist as product of conditions. Nothing exists without causes and conditions. Nothing is intrinsically real in its own nature. To return to this sense of vipassana, when the mind penetrates the nature of dhammas again and again and sees them as insubstantial, impermanent, so forth, and then this dissolves the binding of the mind to samsaric becoming. The process is undermined and the mind is allowed to slip free. So in this way, it becomes essentially a matter of seeing things clearly as the crucial step in the process. Now, we might ask, in returning to a variation of our original question, we might ask, why is this so difficult to do? You know, why can't we just do that naturally and easily? Why are we constantly seeing things wrongly, and why do we have to work so hard to come to this point of vipassana? And the reason is for the three characteristics are not seen clearly by the mind because each one is disguised in a characteristic way. The ordinary habit of the unawakened mind is confused. The characteristic of impermanence is disguised by the illusion of continuity. The Abhidhamma sense of reality is that there are discrete moments, moments of reality succeeding one another. And because of the underlying principle of causality, things are not random, they arise according to causes and conditions. There's necessarily a similarity between succeeding moments. So the mind is fooled into seeing things as persisting and as continuous. When looked at the level of individual dhammas and individual mind moments, things are flashing in and out of existence. And there is a way of experiencing this when the meditator is deep into the vipassana and things are going well, and there's not a lot of struggle. There can be a sense in the mind of seeing things in this sort of momentary way, almost like a very, very rapid strobe light, seeing reality as kind of digital rather than analog. Seeing succeeding moments one after the other, bang, 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 rather than a smooth transition, which in itself is not an ultimate reality, but just another way of perceiving. And our ordinary unawakened perception is to see things as smooth, as sort of smooth transition from moment to moment. Now, think of the metaphor of a film. Not talking about, I don't know, I'm not really sure how they do it nowadays with the modern digital technology, but the old days they had like a roll of film you put through a projector. And what that is a sequence of still pictures, right? And they're brought onto the screen rapidly succeeding one another. Um, and originally, the first films they were on a cycle of 4 images per second, and that's not quite quick enough for the mind to perceive as smooth. So you look at very old films, Charlie Chaplin or something, they look kind of jumpy, jerky, right? And then they went to more frames per second, and the mind loses any sense of discreteness, and it's just absolutely smooth, but it's really just a sequence of still pictures. And this is how the mind actually works in perceiving reality. Is there's a momentary flashes of perception, and then they're smoothed over by the processing in the mind, and we have a sense of things being continuous. When in ultimate reality, in the level of paramattha dhammas, nothing persists for more than a single moment. But because they're similar, succeeding moments are similar, there's a sense of continuity. And this masks the concept of impermanence. The idea of not self, of emptiness, is masked by the illusion of compactness, which means seeing things as compact or discrete objects. And this is a mode of perceiving that has obvious utilitarian basis in dealing with the world, that we have to perceive discrete objects to be able to manipulate the world and do things. So we see a chair, a table, a person, a dog, a cat, a tree, whereas with more analysis, all these things are made up of parts and essentially of atoms, and it's all just our kind of grouping of things into compact or discrete objects, which is ultimately arbitrary, that prevents the mind from seeing the emptiness, the voidness of things. One of the benefits of doing body meditation, like 32 parts of the body, is to break up the sense of the body as compact. When we perceive the body of our own body or the body of another being, we tend to see that as a discrete, compact object, and not as a composite, like a bag of skin, a scaffold of bones, and various organs and fluids. And we're not perceiving things in that way. Although that's unless we make an effort, unless we try to see things in that way, our natural perception is to see discrete units. And this sense of compactness, when we look at our own mind, this is one of the ways in which we fall into the illusion of self, because we're seeing the processes of the mind as compact, as substantial, rather than seeing momentary flashing of processes. And even if we go a little bit further and break the mental processes down into various factors, there's still a desire, a tendency somewhere to privilege some aspect as the self. This is the sense of self that is countered in the questions of King Milinda's question by the simile of the chariot, when Menander was asking the monk Nagasena, where is the self? The Monk Nagasena gave him the simile of the chariots, a famous illustration. He said, you came here today on the chariot. If we break the chariot up into parts and pieces, to take all the boards apart and strew them around, and the hub and the wheel and the backboard and the seat, and make a big pile of parts. In that pile of parts, you pick out the essence of chariot. And the king says, well, there's no such thing. With some more kind of Socratic back and forth, he gets him to define chariot as no more than a name, a designation for these parts when they're arranged in such and such a way properly, then we can call it chariot. But there's no single part that's essence of chariot. So it is with the mind. There's no privileged point on the mind that we call a self. It's all just either subjective or objective processes. And the characteristic of dukkha, or suffering, is masked by change of postures. That's kind of interesting in that one is kind of different than the other two. The other two, they're more sort of philosophical, conceptual ideas of why we don't see them. We don't see them because we're kind of conceiving things in a wrong way. We're conceiving them as continuous or as compact. But dukkha is hidden in a much more sort of down-to-earth, rudimentary way by change of postures, which means we fidget too much so we don't see the reality. And this is illustrated easily with people who begin meditating. It's very common for the first while in meditation, the difficulty is pains in the body. That it's very difficult to sit because you pains in the legs or pains in the back or the neck, or this is a constant complaint, and it's something that recurs throughout, but it's particularly problematic for beginners. And to some degree it might be like wrong posture or so on, but to a large degree it's just a simple fact of sitting still. The human body is naturally going to hurt. This is always dukkha in the body. This is just a part of having a body. And in ordinary life, when we're not trying to clearly observe things on a moment-by-moment level, we unconsciously, or very close to unconsciously, just fidget away from the dukkha. People don't sit still. Even they're sitting in their comfy chair at home, every few minutes they'll shift their weight to the other hip, or they'll cross their leg, or they'll rest on the other elbow. And they just do this naturally and continually. And it works on the principle of a change is as good as a rest, because the constellation of dukkha becomes, in a still body, becomes more and more evident. Then you change the posture, the constellation moves around, and it's not evident at first, and it takes a while for the mind to catch up to it. Yeah? But if you're sitting still, then you don't escape it. It's just there, and you have to deal with it. And it takes a while for the practitioner to become, oh yeah, okay, that's just the body. That's just the way it is. There's also mental fidgeting. So we can't sit still mentally either, because the mind is constantly fidgeting away from experience of dukkha, mental dukkha, and looking for distractions. And if there's no distractions externally, then the mind can fabricate distractions to play with. This is another form of masking dukkha, fidgeting away from the present moment, from reality, from what's here and now. And this kind of fidgeting is a big contributing factor to ignorance, because it's not wanting to know, not wanting to penetrate reality, so we escape it by fidgeting and moving away from it. So these are the ways in which the three characteristics, this is why the three characteristics are not immediately, obviously known, because we're conceiving things in a wrong way, and we're not looking at things properly, correctly. And the way to overcome that is not analytical or using the analytical mind or theorizing about it. It's by trying to get down to the bedrock reality of things as they actually are, and just experiencing this samsaric sequence of dhammas in their own nature as they actually are, moment by moment, without fueling the fire, without stoking the process, but allowing the dhammas to arise in the mind. They will arise according to causes and conditions, previous karma and other factors. There'll be an endless sequence of dhammas in the mind as long as the mind is not immersed in the unconditioned. There will always be dhammas presenting themselves. And if the mind is not disciplined, it reacts to these dhammas according to ill will or craving. It reacts with desire or with distaste and recoil. It becomes either fascinated or fearful. And this is the underlying fuel of the process. If the process isn't fueled, it continues to run on for a time, and the objects are seen clearly. Then this allows the mind to begin to disengage and to become dispassionate and clear, and eventually to slip sideways, as it were, out of the cycle of the process of becoming, and to realize the unconditioned. In one sense, you could say that it's really very simple. There's nothing to it. It's just stop doing what you're doing. You're basically just entangling yourself moment by moment. You just stop doing that, and then you realize the unconditioned. So, and it's only just like that one mind moment away. So in that sense, you could say that it's very simple, but don't be discouraged, because it's also very difficult in that it's such an ingrained habit of mind going back many, many lifetimes, essentially infinitum, of dealing with things otherwise, dealing with things according to this factors of craving and of ignorance and of fear and of distaste, attraction and repulsion. This is the ingrained habit of the mind. And at a very deep level, with the underlying factors of craving for becoming and not becoming, are related to this innate impulse of the mind, very deep habit of the mind to want to take an object, to define itself by the taking of objects. And this is why these factors are cut deeper than sense desire, which only binds us to one mode of consciousness. It doesn't bind us to the whole web. We can get past sense desire and still be bound up, because there's a desire for becoming, and the mind becomes in relationship to the object. So the mind has an underlying desire to define itself by the object. There's subject-object. And each moment the mind is grasping at the next object. This is a very ingrained, deep, rudimentary habit, tendency of the mind that can't be broken by force of will. It has to be worn down through clear seeing. And there's a sense of the liberation comes through a kind of weariness or boredom with samsara. That when it's seen clearly, the mind is, it doesn't want to play that game anymore. This game is stupid. Like playing Pac-Man endlessly. This is pretty pointless. You just stop doing that at some point. So I'll stop there.